Diane is 27, in her bathroom, Monday morning, 1962. Cold cream sits by the sink. A girdle waits nearby. A lipstick tube stands beside her compact. A salon card is tucked in the mirror. She looks composed, ageless, finished. None of it was accident. Number 2 shows the signature she could not get without a man's name beside hers. Number 1 shows why aging could cost a woman her job. Number 12, the girdle rule. Before anything else, Diane reaches for the girdle draped over the chair. The elastic pulls tight with a small, familiar grunt, the kind of sound that never makes it into an old photograph. Stewardess grooming lists from the 1950s specified a well-fitted girdle for a proper silhouette beneath a uniform. And that expectation reached far past the airlines, into department stores, offices, church halls, anywhere a woman's shape might be observed and quietly judged in passing. A visible line under a skirt did not read as minor. It read as careless, sloppy, unfinished. Sales clerks noticed it, co-workers noticed it, even other women noticed it first, and said nothing out loud because nothing needed to be said. Everyone already knew the standard without a single memo being circulated. The rule was never printed anywhere Diane could point to and argue with. It simply lived in the room, the way certain rules do, disappearing into routine until nobody remembers agreeing to them in the first place. The girdle was not comfort, it was compliance, laced in before breakfast, before coffee, before a single word had been spoken that day. The shape came first that morning. The face came next. Number 11. The weekly set. Tucked into the mirror frame is a small card. Thursday, 5:30. Wash and set. The mid-century salon appointment was never framed as indulgence. It was upkeep, as routine and unremarkable as laundry, repeated week after week, so a woman's hair held its shape all the way through Monday's harsh office light. Inside the salon, hooded dryers hum in a row, and the air carries the sharp smell of setting lotion and faintly singed curls. Rollers click against porcelain trays. Combs rest in blue disinfectant jars along the counter. Skip the appointment, even once, and unset hair did not read as busy or simply human. It read as tired, careless, possibly unwell, possibly troubled. Neighbors noticed the difference at church. Co-workers noticed it Monday morning and asked, lightly, if everything was all right at home. The appointment was never really for Thursday evening. It was for the version of herself who would walk into an office 5 mornings later, under fluorescent lights that forgave absolutely nothing. Her hair had a schedule now, set not by her own preference but by other people's eyes, watching carefully without appearing to watch at all. A schedule for hair, it turned out, was only the beginning. Next came a schedule for her face. Number 10. The bare face rule. Diane clicks open her lipstick tube, a motion so practiced she barely registers it anymore, the faint wax smell rising as color moves across her mouth in one steady, unhurried pass. In many offices and service jobs of the era, lipstick was never treated as decoration. It was baseline presentability, the kind etiquette columns and workplace custom simply assumed, the way they assumed clean shoes, or combed hair, or a straight seam down the back of a stocking. A bare face in daylight risked a different kind of attention than a woman might reasonably expect. Was she unwell? Was she tired? Was something wrong at home that morning that she wasn't saying out loud? The questions arrived quickly, and from people who had no real business asking them in the first place. So the lipstick went on, every single morning, whether she felt like smiling that day or not, whether her night had been good or genuinely difficult. The twist was never really about color, or vanity, or even beauty in the way the advertisements liked to sell it in glossy magazine pages. It was about being read, instantly, as alert, awake, and fully ready before she had spoken a single word to anyone in the building. Her face had a rule now, quiet and constant, applied every single morning without exception. Soon, so did her name. Number 9. The nameplate problem. In Diane's handbag sits a small brass nameplate, ready for her desk the moment she sits down. Miss D. Whitfield. It weighs almost nothing resting in her palm, and it announces almost everything about her before she has said a single word to anyone that morning. Office custom in this era commonly addressed women by Miss or Mrs., often stamped directly onto the furniture itself, so that every visitor who passed her desk learned her marital status, before they learned what she actually did for a living, or how well she did it. She did not choose to publish that piece of her life to every stranger walking the hallway. It simply sat there, in brass, in plain view, all day long, for anyone to read and interpret however they liked, over and over, desk after desk, down the row. Curiosity followed naturally, the way it always does around a small, unguarded fact. So did comments, offered lightly, about whether miss was still the accurate word, or whether that might be changing soon for a girl her age. The nameplate was never simply courtesy, the way a company brochure might have described it. It was a small, standing public record, updated only when a ring rearranged the letters sitting on her desk for everyone to notice. A title stamped in brass told the room something before Diane ever opened her mouth to speak. And once her name carried a rule, her voice was next in line. Number 8. The office voice. The telephone on Diane's desk rings, and she lifts the receiver into a voice trained specifically for this exact moment, calmer and softer than the one she uses with her sister on a Sunday afternoon at home. Many offices and switchboard rooms of the period coached women toward a steady, pleasant, carefully modulated tone, treating a raised voice or a clipped answer as unprofessional in a way that was rarely, if ever, applied to the men working down the very same hallway. The line clicks faintly as the connection forms, a small mechanical sound underneath every single call she takes throughout the day. If she sounded tired, or short, or simply human on a genuinely hard day, the word that followed her afterward was never tired. It was difficult, unfeminine, not a team player, whispered somewhere in a hallway she wasn't standing in to defend herself. Her actual voice, unfiltered, warm, occasionally sharp when it needed to be, had no real place at that desk between 9 and 5. Even her voice, it turned out, had a dress code, invisible on any paper anyone could show her, but constantly, quietly enforced by everyone around her, day after day. That sounds harmless until you notice exactly who was doing the enforcing, without ever once writing the rule down on anything official. And if her voice had to stay pleasant all day long, so, eventually, did her whole face. Number 7. The smile that wasn't optional. At the front of the office, Diane greets a visitor with the exact same expression she wore an hour earlier, regardless of the headache building steadily behind her eyes since lunch. Across service and clerical jobs of this era, waitressing, stewardessing, receptionist work of every kind training put more weight on smiling, makeup, and general poise than it did on the actual skill being performed for the paycheck at the end of the week. Cheerfulness was never simply requested politely. It was expected, quietly, constantly, as though it arrived free with the job description, no negotiation required, no exceptions granted for a bad morning. By 4 in the afternoon, her cheeks genuinely ache from holding the same practice shape for hours on end without a real break. Fail to hold it, even briefly, even once, and the word attached to her was never honest or tired or simply human that day. It was cold, difficult, not a team player. The same worn phrase used for 100 other small refusals across 100 other desks. The smile was never really an emotion crossing her face in the moment it appeared. It was a uniform requirement, with no visible fabric, worn from 9 to 5 whether she felt a single flicker of it or not that day. Until this point, the rules had lived quietly in her mirror and her handbag, places she largely controlled with her own 2 hands. The next ones lived somewhere else entirely, in the room around her, in files she would never actually see. Number 6. The coffee rule no one wrote down. Every single morning before her boss arrives, Diane fills the percolator, and the office slowly fills with its familiar, faintly bitter smell. No one has ever asked her to do this out loud, not once, not directly. It appears nowhere in her actual job description, nowhere in anything she ever signed on her first day. In many offices of this era, clerical culture simply absorbed coffee service, tidying, and remembering a boss's small preferences as an informal extension of a secretary's role, invisible on paper and constant, expected, in daily practice from the very first week. Skip it once, even by accident, even with a good reason, and she becomes, quietly, not helpful. Not a team player, a phrase that follows her the rest of the week. The coffee itself cost the company nothing at all, not 1 cent. It cost Diane a small piece of her own morning. Every single morning, indefinitely, entirely unpaid, folded into a job that already had a full list of paid duties waiting on her desk. It was not written into her contract anywhere she had access to. It was written into the room instead, and everyone standing in that room already understood it perfectly, which is exactly why nobody ever bothered to put it down on paper for anyone to sign. Until now, the rules lived in her handbag and her compact, places she chose. The next ones lived in a file cabinet down the hall, places she did not. The coffee cost her nothing that anyone could point to and measure. The next rule could cost her the job itself. Number 5. The errand nobody assigned. In the back pages of Diane's own notebook sits a running list that belongs to her boss more than it belongs to her. His wife's birthday, the dry cleaner's hours, which restaurant he prefers for client lunches downtown near the office. Many clerical roles of this era quietly absorb this exact kind of remembering, treating a woman's attentiveness as personality rather than labor, and rewarding it with nothing more concrete than continued approval and the simple absence of complaint from above. Other women modeled the behavior first, long before Diane arrived, so over time it looked less like a rule and more like simple good manners, the kind nobody would think to question out loud in a meeting. The pencil scratches softly against the page as she adds one more note to a list that never seems to actually end, week after week. Refuse this kind of quiet tracking, even once, even politely, and she was not principled. She was difficult, a word that followed women who declined far more often than it ever followed men who never had to decline anything. Competence and service were graded together on the very same invisible scale, though only one of the two ever showed up on a paycheck at the end of the month, in ink anyone could see. This particular labor stayed entirely invisible, tucked into notebooks, memory, and habit. The next rule made her whole body visible instead, and measured, on a scale with an actual number attached to it. Number 4. The scale behind the glamour. In a magazine article on stewardess glamour, Diane reads past the smiling photographs to the fine print underneath and recognizes the same quiet discipline sitting in her own daily reflection. Documented airline hiring sheets from Chicago and Southern Airlines in 1954 and from United Airlines in 1968 listed hard-weight ceilings tied directly to height in United's case. No more than 135 pounds, regardless of an individual woman's natural build or frame. The requirement was checked once at hiring, and checked again afterward, at regular intervals, on a scale kept in a back office, with no photographs on any wall, nothing glamorous in sight. The metal platform was cold underfoot, plain, unglamorous, nothing at all like the cabin waiting just outside that door. The number returned flat and indifferent, caring nothing for context, nothing for effort, nothing for how the week had gone. Step over the limit, even slightly, even by a pound or two, and the consequence was suspension or dismissal outright. No matter how well she had handled a cabin full of passengers, 30,000 feet above solid ground, the scale did not care how well she did the job. It never once had, and it never would. This one was not really about beauty, in any simple sense a magazine might sell. It was about being allowed to stay in the room, in the uniform, on the payroll at all. A body could be measured on command, on schedule. So, it turned out, could a woman's age. Number 3, the age limit nobody forgot. In an airline personnel file, a birth date sits quietly among a column of other numbers, waiting patiently for its moment to matter. Airlines in this era commonly enforced mandatory retirement for stewardesses somewhere between 32 and 35 years old, treating the entire job as a brief interval before marriage rather than a career a woman might reasonably want to keep for the long run of her working life. At 27, Diane already knows women 5 years older being quietly phased out of positions they were genuinely good at, their personnel files closing with a small, dry rustle that almost nobody else in the office ever seemed to notice or mention out loud. There was no dramatic announcement attached to any of it, no farewell party, no explanation offered. There was simply a date circled somewhere on a calendar in someone else's office, and then, not long after, there wasn't a job there anymore for that woman to return to. The countdown on her career, had she chosen that particular path at 18 or 20, would have started the very day she was hired, ticking forward steadily whether she noticed the ticking or not, whether she still felt young enough to ignore it. The next rule was written down, somewhere official, in a file with a stamp on it, and that made it harder to simply ignore or argue away in casual conversation over lunch. Age could end a job on a fixed, predictable schedule, printed and filed in advance. A wedding ring, it turned out, could end one faster, with no schedule required at all, and no warning printed anywhere. Number 2. The marriage bar and the signature. A coworker resigns quietly the week after her engagement is announced at the office. No scandal attached to it, no argument in the hallway, simply a clean, unremarked gap where a familiar desk used to be occupied every single morning. Documented research on marriage bars from this era, including employer statements collected by economic historian Claudia Golden, shows firms across teaching, clerical work, and other fields plainly stating that mothers of young children were not hired, and that married women were not encouraged to return once they had already left the payroll. Pregnancy, in a number of these same period records, was treated openly as cause for what employers themselves called a voluntary resignation, a phrase that did a great deal of quiet, deliberate work behind the scenes. Diane remembers a separate afternoon at a downtown bank, fluorescent light humming overhead, her father's signature required directly beside her own on a store credit application, even though the income being borrowed against belonged entirely, provably, to her alone. Before federal credit protections finally arrived in 1974, women in many banks commonly needed a husband's or a male relative's signature simply to open credit in their own name. Regardless of their earnings, their savings, or their standing in the community they lived in, the pen scratched across paper that plainly needed one more name than it reasonably should have required from anyone. This is the point where a small word on paper begins to cost real, measurable money. The ring was small. For a great many women, the consequence attached to it was not small at all. Everything up to this point in the countdown could be worn, styled, or smiled away by the following morning without much cost. This last rule could not be smiled away by anyone, no matter how practiced the smile. It required somebody else's signature, whether she liked it or not, whether she had earned every dollar herself. Number 1. The work was real. The future was conditional. Diane's paycheck envelope sits on the kitchen table, thin, familiar, and entirely real in her hand, the ink of her own name printed across the front. The Equal Pay Act of 1963 declared that her labor was worth the same as a man's doing identical work beside her, and on paper, that declaration was genuine progress as far as any single law could reach into an ordinary office. But her labor being formally counted was never quite the same thing as her future being guaranteed by anyone above her. The documented record of this era marriage bars that quietly ended careers at the altar, pregnancy treated openly as grounds for resignation, mandatory retirement waiting patiently at 32, credit that required a second, male signature before it would ever be granted points toward one consistent, largely unspoken worldview, running underneath all 12 rules on this list, quietly connecting every single one of them. A woman's competence was acknowledged, openly and often, in reviews, in raises, in praise from supervisors. Her income was acknowledged too, on paper, in the paycheck itself, in black and white. But her long-term claim to a job, a loan, or a career remained provisional, always subject to sudden review the moment she married, or aged, or became pregnant. Regardless of how well she had performed the work itself for years, she never simply aged slowly and gracefully, the way old photographs and family albums make it appear from a comfortable distance decades later. She managed the appearance of not aging, carefully, daily, deliberately, because aging itself, like marrying or turning 32, was treated as a liability to be hidden for as long as humanly possible. The girdle, the lipstick, the pleasant telephone voice, the coffee she made every single morning without ever being asked, none of that was ever really vanity. Whatever the advertisements liked to imply in their glossy pages, it was upkeep on a much larger system that was always quietly, keeping score in the background, whether she could see the scoreboard or not. The work was real. The paycheck was real. The skill behind both of them was entirely real, earned every single day. The future was the one part no one ever actually guaranteed her. No matter how carefully, how faithfully, she kept every single rule on this list, year after year. That was the quiet arithmetic underneath 12 separate rules that never once looked like arithmetic from the outside. The word was not written on the paycheck. It did not need to be. Everyone who worked beside her already understood it, the same way Diane understood the girdle, the lipstick, and the appointment card, before anyone ever explained a single one of them to her out loud. The mirror never changed one bit. What we see reflected in it now certainly has. Diane is older now. At that same mirror, the same jar of cold cream open by the sink, her hands moving through familiar gestures. None of it was really about beauty. It was maintenance on rules, mostly never written down, which made them hardest to fight. If a rule like this lived in your mother's handbag, tell us the object below, subscribe, and find the next hidden rule with us.